The clock tower in the center of our town hasn't ticked in 20 years. To most people walking by in their daily hurry, it is just a giant, gray shadow hanging over the square, a silent ghost of a time when things were built to last for generations rather than replaced in a season. The heavy iron hands are frozen forever at 12 minutes past 4, paralyzed by thick orange rust and the heavy weight of decades of neglect. For the younger residents, the tower is simply a convenient landmark for meeting friends after school. But for the elders, it is a painful reminder of a rhythmic pulse that once gave this entire town its steady heartbeat. Every afternoon, an old man named Elias walks past the tower and pauses for a long moment. He looks up at the dusty glass face with a look of deep, personal recognition. He remembers the cold winter days when the bronze bell would ring so clearly that you could hear the echo in the next valley over. To everyone else, the machine is dead and cold. But for Elias, it is a sleeping giant he has been waiting to hear breathe again. Elias spends his long days in a small, quiet shop tucked away in a narrow alley where the sun only hits the pavement at noon. The cramped space is filled with the comforting smell of light machine oil and aged cedar wood. He is surrounded by thousands of tiny gears no larger than a ladybug and silver springs that seem to hum with a secret energy when they are touched by his tools. At 84 years old, his physical body has naturally slowed down, and his weathered hands carry a slight tremble when he reaches for his morning cup of tea. However, the exact moment he picks up a pair of thin brass tweezers or a magnifying glass, that shaking vanishes completely. His fingers remember every hidden secret of the mechanical world, moving with a grace and speed that completely defies his age. He often tells the few regular customers he has that machines are very much like people. They do not want to be cast aside or replaced. They just want to be truly understood. He keeps a special secret locked in a heavy iron safe behind his workbench. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, a man in a sharp, expensive suit named Miller stood in the doorway of the shop, looking like a splash of cold water in a warm room. Miller did not look at the beautiful, handcrafted clocks ticking on the walls. He only looked at the small cracks in the plaster ceiling with a judgmental eye. He represented a large international firm that saw our humble town not as a community of families, but as a prime location for a new glass office complex and luxury apartments. Miller pulled a thick check from his leather briefcase and slid it across the wooden counter toward Elias. The massive amount of money written on that paper could buy a quiet, luxurious life on the sunny coast, far away from the biting cold winters of the valley. Elias did not even pick the paper up to look at the numbers or the signature. He simply continued cleaning the tiny gears of a small gold pocket watch, his face as calm and unreadable as still water. He knew that Miller didn't understand that some things in this life are not for sale, no matter how many zeros are written on a check. Elias didn't need a government report to tell him the world was eroding. He saw it in the hollowed-out shells of neighboring towns, where neon signs now hung over places that used to have names and histories. Every time a brick wall fell to make room for glass and cheap steel, a bit of the town's collective memory seemed to evaporate, leaving the streets feeling like a stage set, clean, bright, and utterly empty of soul. Elias has read these government reports and seen the changes with his own eyes in all the neighboring counties. He knows that once the architectural soul of a street is torn down and replaced by cold glass and cheap steel, the spirit of the neighborhood never truly comes back to the people. He looks at the modern blueprints Miller left on his counter and thinks about the stone tower in the square. He wonders if his quiet silence is enough to protect the town's history from the wrecking ball. The town council is growing visibly desperate as the end of the year approaches. The annual Christmas Eve ceremony is only a few days away, and the mayor has made a very bold promise to the citizens in the local newspaper. He wants the old clock tower to ring its massive bell for the first time since the Great Frost of 2 decades ago. The council has called every modern engineering firm in the state, but they all gave the same disappointing answer. The original blueprints are written in an ancient, forgotten language of hand-forged iron and simple gravity that no modern computer program can fully simulate or repair. They need someone who still speaks the mechanical language of the old world. Eventually, the mayor and the tired council members ended up at the door of the small shop in the alley, looking humbled. They asked Elias to do the impossible, even though many of them had secretly supported Miller's new development plan just a few weeks before. Elias looked at them, knowing his skills were their last hope. Elias agreed to take on the massive task, but he had one very specific and strange condition. He insisted that Miller, the man who wanted to tear the entire square down, must accompany him every single step of the way up the tower. Together, the two men approached the heavy oak base of the tower as the sun began to set. They began to climb the narrow, spiral stone stairs that led into the dark, hollow heart of the structure. The air inside was thick with decades of gray dust and the heavy, metallic smell of cold, frozen oil. Miller complained loudly the entire way about his expensive leather shoes getting ruined and the lack of a modern elevator. Meanwhile, Elias moved upward with a strange, new energy, touching the rough stone walls with his bare palms, as if he were greeting an old friend he hadn't seen in many years. As they finally reached the high wooden platform where the giant machinery sat, the winter wind began to howl through the narrow stone slats. The clock mechanism looked like a terrifying, frozen labyrinth of rusted steel and giant, jagged pulleys. To Miller's untrained eyes, it was nothing more than a pile of expensive, heavy junk that belonged in a scrapyard. He shook his head and told Elias that they were wasting their precious time on a pile of worthless trash. To Elias, however, it looked like a beautiful, complex story that had been rudely interrupted in the middle of a very important sentence. He pulled a small, brass lantern from his bag and began to inspect the giant gears one by one, looking for the source of the silence. After nearly an hour of perfect silence, he stopped and pointed his warm light at a single, tiny area near the center of the main drive train. He had finally found a bent iron pin, no longer than a human finger, which had been crushed during the Great Frost. This one small, broken piece had held the entire massive system captive and silent for 20 long years. Miller laughed out loud when he saw the small, bent pin, thinking the repair would be finished in a matter of minutes. However, Elias shook his head with a very grave and serious expression. Fixing a machine of this great age and complexity requires much more than just a modern replacement part from a local hardware store. It requires the exact tension and weight of a hand-wound carbon steel spring that hasn't been manufactured anywhere in the world since the year 1950. Without that specific, historic part, the timing would be completely off, and the internal pressure would eventually cause the giant gears to shatter into 1,000 pieces. Miller scoffed at this, leaning against a dusty wooden beam and checking his digital watch with annoyance. He argued that it would be much easier and cheaper to just tear the whole tower down and put up a bright digital display that would never break. He simply didn't understand that a digital screen has no pulse, no weight, and no soul. Elias led a frustrated and bored Miller back down the stairs and into his small, warm shop. The old man walked to the very back of the room and pulled a heavy wooden box from a hidden shelf under his workbench. He carefully wiped the thick dust from the lid and opened it with a small silver key he kept around his neck. Inside sat the master spring, a perfect, gleaming circle of polished blue steel. It was the absolute prize of his entire lifetime collection, a part he had saved for 40 years for his own private retirement project. It was a piece of history that could never be replaced by any modern factory. Without saying a single word to Miller, Elias began to clean the spring with a soft silk cloth, preparing it for its new home in the tower. Miller watched him closely, noticing for the first time how much care and love the old man took with his work. He began to realize the true, heavy value of what Elias was giving up for the town. The escapement waited like a held breath. It was the gatekeeper of time, the only thing standing between the gravity of the heavy weights and the rhythmic heartbeat the town had forgotten. It is a brilliant, old system that converts the constant downward pull of a falling weight into a series of small, regular movements that turn the hands on the clock face. Without this incredibly precise balance of tension and release, the energy would all drop at once, causing the clock to either race ahead at a high speed or stand perfectly still in failure. This balance is the most delicate part of any large-scale mechanical clock, requiring perfect alignment to function for decades without stopping. Elias knows that if the escapement in the tower is not perfectly tuned to his master spring, the entire effort will fail in a single instant. He looks at his hands, hoping they are still steady enough for this final task. Christmas Eve finally arrived, bringing a cold, biting wind that stung the skin. Below in the town square, a massive crowd began to gather, their faces glowing in the soft, flickering light of hundreds of handheld candles. High up in the dark, freezing tower, Elias and Miller were still working by the dim, orange light of a single flickering lantern. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and the cold metal was actually painful to touch with bare skin. Miller was no longer looking at his expensive watch or complaining about his ruined, dusty suit. Instead, he was standing perfectly still, holding the heavy flashlight steady so Elias could see the tiny holes for the pins. He even used his own expensive silk tie to wipe away a smudge of thick grease that was blocking Elias's view of the gears. They worked in a deep, focused silence, two men from completely different worlds trying to bring one mechanical heart back to life before the deadline. Down in the crowded square, the mayor began his annual speech, but the crowd was unusually quiet and still. Everyone was looking up at the dark, silent clock face against the night sky. High above, Elias carefully placed the master spring into the core of the ancient machine. His fingers moved with a sudden, youthful precision that surprised even him. He signaled for Miller to help him slowly release the heavy lead weights that hung from the thick, rusted chains. As the weight finally took hold, the giant iron gears began to groan and creak under the new, intense pressure. A thick layer of old rust and dust flaked off the metal like old, dead skin falling away from a healing wound. For a long, terrifying second, there was absolutely no movement at all. The weights hung frozen in the air, and the giant pendulum remained perfectly still. Elias held his breath, his hand resting gently on the main drive wheel. For a second, there was only a chilling silence. Then, a sharp, metallic clack echoed through the stone chamber. It was followed by a long, heart-pounding pause, and then another loud clack. The massive brass pendulum began its slow, rhythmic dance, swinging back and forth with a power that literally shook the old floorboards beneath their feet. Miller looked at the spinning gears and then looked down at Elias's weathered, oil-stained hands with a look of pure wonder. He saw, for the very first time, that some things in this world are not obsolete just because they are old. He realized that these mechanical foundations are what give a community its sense of permanence and its quiet strength. The clock wasn't just telling the people below what time it was was telling them that they belonged to something that lasted much longer than a single human life. Miller reached into his pocket and felt the sharp edges of the eviction papers he had brought for the shop. As the clock hands finally reached the 12, the massive bronze bell rang out across the entire valley. It was a deep, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate in the chests of everyone standing in the square below. The people broke into a deafening, joyful cheer that rose up to the tower windows. They weren't cheering for a new building or a modern development. They were cheering for a piece of their own history that had finally returned home to them. In the tower, Miller watched the pure joy of the people through the small, narrow stone window. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the legal contract that would have demolished the entire block, and quietly tore it into 100 small pieces. He dropped the white paper into the cold wind, watching it disappear into the falling snow like confetti. He finally understood that a prime location is completely worthless if you destroy the very reason why people love being there in the first place. Elias did not go downstairs to find a bronze plaque or wait for a loud public thank you from the mayor and the council. He simply sat down on the cold stone tower ledge, his legs dangling over the edge, watching the sea of candles moving below him. He listened to the steady, healthy heartbeat of the town ticking perfectly behind him. The past wasn't a weight to be carried or a ghost to be feared. It was the anchor that kept the valley from drifting away into the dark. Tonight, the ghost of Main Street was gone, replaced by a living, breathing symbol of true craftsmanship and human care. The town was no longer just a collection of old buildings. It was finally a home again for everyone who lived there. Elias closed his eyes, feeling the gentle vibration of the bell one last time, perfectly content in the warmth of the cold winter night.